Okay, this is part two of a lecture on Epicurus. So we're concentrating on the ethical teaching, and the first part has to do with eliminating all fears. And Epicurus thought that most fears are rooted in the fear of death. And he, being an atomist and a materialist, he believed that at death, there's just the cessation of all sensation, and the atoms are dissipated back into the universe. So it's just like nothingness. We live one time. I call it radical finitude. Now that's upsetting to a lot of people, but for him, it's the release of all fear, of any kind of fear of the afterlife or fear of death. And it focuses all the emphasis then on this life, to make this life into something worthy. So he wants to eliminate all fear, and not just fear of death, but bodily pains, fear of anything. He wants his disciples, his followers, to be absolutely fearless. The other thing, the other negative side of the letter to Menoesis, which is the one primary text we have on his moral teaching, is a more appropriate understanding, an adequate idea of divinity or the divinities. And he wants us not, he has this concept of divinity as being completely independent of all agitations, that the one, the divinity, is existing in a state of disinterest or ataraxia, without agitations. So it's not concerned with it doesn't, it's not concerned with individual prayers or individuals. It's just this almighty power that gives rise to the universe. And so it lives independent of the cares and worries of humans. So he goes off on that at the beginning of his letter to Menoesis and develops, he thinks it's blasphemous, or he doesn't use the word blasphemous, but impious, to have a false understanding of divinity, that we're projecting our own human qualities into the divine and making the divine into something all too human. But after that, then he enters into his the positive side of his theory. And he claims that hedone, Hedone, is the beginning and end of what he calls the blessed life. So hedone means pleasure in Greek. So for Epicurus, pleasure or hedone means the health of the body and a soul without disturbances, a soul that exists for the most part in ataraxia, in a state of without disturbances. So this notion of pleasure is very different from this notion of pleasure as the fulfillment of a lack. Well, we need to think about the different kinds of pleasures for Epicurus. But pleasure in this sense, Epicurus claims, is the mainspring and also the final end of the blessed life. So what does he mean by the mainstream and the final end? He means, by mainstream, he means it's the motive of all of our actions, of anyone who wants to achieve eudaimonia. And by final, he means that the satisfaction comes in the action itself. So when such pleasure is sustained throughout one's life, for the most part, then one can be said to have attained lifelong happiness. And he calls this eudaimonia, using the same word that Aristotle used before him and Plato before Aristotle. So in the first part of his letter to Menoesis, then, we find him talking about how philosophy functions to render free all of our fears. And in the next section, we hear that the beginning and end of all of the blessed life is hedone, is pleasure. We hear Epicurus's famous pronouncement of pleasure as the highest good. So Epicurus is like the chief spokesman of hedonism. But this is called, later on, intellectual historians have categorized this as ethical hedonism. There was another kind of hedonism that was around, the Syriatics, who believed that physical pleasure is the highest good. But but Epicurus is going to include physical pleasure. Pleasure itself is the good. Pain is evil. Or, of course, the word evil wasn't around then, so the word is bad, good and bad. I preserve the word evil for any kind of Christian notion of morality. Then we can talk about good and evil. But in ancient Greek philosophy, there's no talk of evil. I just use good and bad. So pleasure is good, pain is bad. But death is nothing. It's neither good nor bad because it's the cessation of all sensation. But the notion of pleasure that Epicurus delivers is not restricted to physical pleasures. Usually when Aristotle talks about pleasure in the Nicomachean Ethics, it's about physical pleasures. If he's talking about any other kind of satisfaction, he usually qualifies it. Like the satisfaction that the eudaimonia that accompanies action in conformity with virtue, that's a different kind of, it's not really pleasure. So the normal notion of pleasure is that it's a fulfillment of a lack, like you're thirsty and you drink, or you're hungry and you eat, or you feel lonely and then you have company. And so it's some lack that needs fulfillment. But for Epicurus, this is not the highest kind of pleasure. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So in the second part of his letter then, we hear Epicurus's famous pronouncement that pleasure is the highest good. We hear him declare that the only natural and necessary desires are for the health of the body and for the tranquility of the soul. Okay, this is an important point. When these are satisfied, when we have a body without pain, and when we have a soul without agitations, we have already arrived at our goal. That's it for Epicurus. Now that sounds kind of anticlimactic, but if you think about it, there's something very appealing to this idea, and I'll try to share that with you as we proceed. What's so appealing about thinking that the highest pleasure is having a body without pain and a mind without agitations? Like most of you that are listening to me right now, I doubt if you're in excruciating pain right now. If you're not, and then if you could only bring about this ataraxia, this state of no tormenting agitations to your mind, for Epicurus, that's the highest pleasure. It's called static pleasure. We'll talk about those in a minute. What I find so appealing about that idea is that we don't have to struggle and search to fulfill some kind of lack, because that's impossible. Because when we do that, the mind is connected with your imagination. You can always conjure up more and more things that you need to be happy. And so if you can embrace Epicurus's idea of happiness as a body without pain and a mind without agitations, that's quite easy to obtain. I mean, there are fixations, things get more complicated than that. Psychology, depth psychology, opens up a whole unconsciousness and fixations and traumas that haven't been processed, and it gets complicated. But on another level, it's quite simple. If you could just concentrate on eliminating all pain from your body and bringing about a mind without agitations, then you've arrived. So that's not as hard. You don't have to struggle all your life. And the other way, if you think that happiness comes by fulfilling a lack, then it's like a black hole. It can never be filled, because you could, what happens is one becomes in a habit of conjuring up all kinds of other things you need. Once you get that, you need more. Then once you get it, you have to think about keeping it. And now you're in the struggle again, and you have all kinds of agitations. So that's the appealing side to Epicurus. The other thing I find appealing is the idea that the activity is the goal. I find that to be a very important thing, especially we people who are living in the 21st century. So many of our activities are means for the sake of some end. So that activity becomes a mean for some end, and then that end becomes a means for some other end. And so your whole life becomes a means, and the end is never achieved. It's like climbing a mountain and thinking, when I get to the top, then I can enjoy this great vista. But the mountain is so big that you don't get there ever. So life becomes a big chore. A chore, what is a chore? It's when you do something, you want to get it done. Like you put out the garbage. You don't have, even putting out the garbage doesn't have to be a chore if you do it in the right state of mind. Zen Buddhism will emphasize that. But it's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. So if you're doing something just to get it done, then there's no satisfaction in the doing. But if you're doing something to enjoy the doing, where the activity becomes the goal, then the activity itself is satisfactory. This is a stumbling block for many people. Most in the world is set up such that we do most of our things for the sake of something else. So we need to start doing things for its own sake, intrinsic, things that have intrinsic value. My trips to Europe, I noticed that was part of the norms. Like in Italy, for example, I mean, they don't have all the answers to everything, and they can be troublesome people. I'm Italian myself, but my trips to Italy, in the afternoons, there's what they call passeggiata. And passeggiata means taking a walk. But it's not just taking a walk. It means taking a walk without going anywhere. So you're just walking around. And they're looking at each other, and they dress up nice, and they look at things. And it's part of the customs of being an Italian citizen. It's just what everybody does. Take a nap in the afternoon, and then clean up, dress up, try to look as good as you can, and then you just go out and walk around. It means taking a walk without going anywhere, with no particular place to go. There's this intrinsic sense that just taking a walk is intrinsically pleasurable. So there's some wisdom in that. And what I find both in Epicurus and in Aristotle, and in different ways, is this idea where, well, here's a quote from the Vatican sayings. The time of the beginning of the greatest good, which is pleasure for Epicurus, and the time of its enjoyment are one. See, there it is. The activity is the goal. So both the beginning and the end of the good life, and by beginning he means the motive, why we should do anything, and what is it for the sake of which we do anything, is pleasure. But he has a very deep and rich understanding of pleasure. And pleasure is not just physical pleasure. And it's not a lack that needs to be fulfilled. That's one kind of pleasure, but it's not the greatest. Now, the other thing that's quite interesting in this letter is his classification of desires. And it's not just in the letter, it's in the principal doctrines. I'm not going to go through all these. I have notes enough to talk, a whole semester just on Epicurus, on this letter. So, and I'm trying to abbreviate everything for you. So I'm just going to give you the numbers of the principal doctrines that connect to these ideas, and I'm not going to read them or comment on them. So if you're interested, and you won't need to do this to do well in the, this course, But if you're interested in Epicurus and you want to read more, then I'll collect these principal doctrines around certain themes. But one of the theme that I want to talk about is his classification of desires. He has a very, let's remember that he wrote over 347 books. So all we have are these three letters. Then we have Lucretius, I told you, that's important, the Roman poet who wrote on the nature of things. That's if you're interested in Epicurus, then that's a necessary book to study. And then we have the lives of the philosophers and the life of Epicurus by Diogenes Laertius. And other people have written about Epicurus, but these are the key. And then the only original primary texts we have, as I told you, are these three letters, the one of which I'm focusing on, the letter to Menoetius. And then we have these Vatican sayings and the principal doctrines. And they're just fragments mostly. Not the principal doctrines, some of them are epigrams. But in all of these extant works we have, there's this classification of desires. So why is this so important? Well, Epicurus thinks that unless you have a proper understanding of desire, then you're going to be tripped up by life. And so we need wisdom so that it's like life is put these tricks in our way. And unless we can see them coming and sidestep them, we're just going to fall prey to this practical joke, which is a serious joke because that's our life. So we need to be philosophical about life so we don't fall prey to these pitfalls that life puts on our way. And they're not just little pitfalls, they're big mistakes that most people make. So one is an improper understanding of desire. Okay, so how does he think about desire? Well, he classifies them. He says there are natural desires and there are vain desires. By vain desires, he means things that are unnatural and unnecessary. What might that be? Well, he mentions honor, he mentions praise, and those types of things. He calls those vain desires. Okay, so he wants us to eliminate all those vain desires. So then we have the natural desires. Of the natural desires, he divides those into three parts. There are necessary natural desires. Of the natural desires, he divides them into two parts. Necessary natural desires, and then just merely natural desires. So necessary natural desires are things like whatever is necessary for happiness. So freedom from fear, freedom from psychic pain. And also of the necessary natural desires, those are those desires that are necessary for the repose of the body, for the balance of the body, the health of the body. Freedom from pain of the body. So that has to do with proper food, proper nutrition, proper exercise, and proper maintenance of the body. So those, and then there are also those that are necessary for life, like shelter, food, water, and so on. So those are the necessary natural desires. The classification is this: there's natural desires and vain desires. Of the natural desires, there's two kinds. There are those necessary natural desires, and then there are the merely natural desires. And of the necessary natural desires, he divides those into three categories. Necessary for happiness, and he mentions freedom from psychic pain, freedom from fear. And then there are those that are necessary for the repose of the body. That would be freedom from pain of the body. And then there are those that are necessary for life, like shelter, food, and water. And then the other kind of natural desires are merely natural desires. Like it's natural to want really good food or really nice clothes or to have sex. But these are merely natural. They're not necessary. They won't bring pain if you don't have it. Okay. Some people think that they bring pain if they don't have sex or if they don't have extravagant food or really nice clothes. But those are really vain desires to think that way. So that's his classification. If you look at Principle Doctrine 26, he has the same classification, only he talks about it differently. Vatican saying, let's see, 67. They're all in Roman numerals. So getting little pop-ups here. So Vatican saying 71, Principle Doctrine 29, Principle Doctrine 30, XXX, Vatican saying 21. So all those are about the classification of desires. So he wants us to eliminate the vain desires and be sure that all of our actions are motivated by natural desires. Eliminate all unnecessary and unnatural desires. So that's easily said than done. So I keep thinking of that quote by Thoreau. I think I mentioned it last time. I consider myself wealthy by the number of things I can afford to let alone. So Thoreau was an Epicurean. I'm sure he read Epicurus. So the knowledge of the classification of the desires enables us to refer all choices and avoidances to the health of the body and the tranquility of the soul. And it's to this end that we always act, namely to avoid pain and fear. All of our desires, therefore, should be necessary and natural desires, desires that are natural and necessary for happiness, that is freedom from all fear and agitations of the soul, necessary and natural desires for repose of the body, that is freedom from bodily pain, or necessary natural desires which are necessary for the maintenance of life, like food, water, and shelter. When these necessary natural desires are secured, all the agitations of the soul are removed. We don't wander through life as though in search of something that's missing, looking for something that can fulfill our soul. I think of that song by the Rolling Stones, Can't Get No Satisfaction. See, once you have an inadequate understanding of the desires, then you can't get no satisfaction. I don't think Mick Jagger had that in mind when he was singing that song. That was more of a social protest song. So we should notice here that for Epicurus, pleasure is not the filling up of some lack or desire of the body or of the soul. This is only a necessary precondition for pleasure. True pleasure, as we're going to see again later on, is not a kinetic pleasure. Now, this is sort of counterintuitive because usually kinetic things are better than static things, right? Kinetic means movement. Static means not moving. And as soon as I hear the difference between movement and not moving, it just seems better to be moving, right? But for Epicurus, kinetic pleasures, which in Greek is anaplerosis, that's called kinetic pleasure. What that means is there's a desire that needs to be filled. Like I'm thirsty and I drink. So anaplerosis means the filling up of a desire. But then there's the kinetic pleasure. I'm sorry, there's the static pleasure, katastamatiki. I learned how to pronounce these things while I was in Greece. I presented a paper on Nietzsche and Epicurus, and then later I turned it into a full-blown essay, and it's published. And when I finish this lecture, I'm going to give you the bibliographical information on that, and then you can read that someday if you like. But it's on Nietzsche and Epicurus. So when I was in Greece, I learned how to pronounce some of these words. Katastamatiki means static pleasure. And that means the absence of disturbances of the body and soul. No pain in your body, no disturbances in your soul. And that's the highest pleasure for Epicurus, ataraxia. So in general, then, the passage tells us that pleasure is the beginning and the motive of all action, and pleasure is also the final end of the blessed life. And the way to attain this is to eliminate all unnatural and unnecessary desires and all vain desires. All desires that are not necessary for life, not necessary for the health of the body, and not necessary for the tranquility of the soul. Pleasure, then, is the first and natural good. Starting from pleasure, we accept and reject anything. So now, when we go through life and there's a choice to be made, we think about pleasure. What will bring pleasure in the long run? So sometimes we have to reject immediate pleasures because they bring with them concomitant pain. So Epicurus wants us to put some thought into our choices. There are some choices we make that provide immediate pleasure, but they bring with them concomitant pain that outweighs the pleasure. And so we avoid that because it doesn't bring pleasure in the long run. And vice versa, there are certain pains that we endure, in fact, bring on, because it brings with it pleasure in the long run, like overcoming resistance. No pain, no gain. You've heard people say that. There's great truth to that. Everyone knows that from exercising. If you don't overcome resistance and exercise, then your muscles atrophy. So there's a little bit more thought that goes into it. We just don't accept any kind of immediate pleasure. We have to think, what will bring pleasure in the long run? And sometimes we have to avoid immediate pleasures because they bring with them concomitant pain, and vice versa. Sometimes we endure immediate resistance, adversity, because it brings with it the strength, it brings with it power. Oh, here's a Principle Doctrine 3 is about this katastamatiki, this static pleasure that he thinks is the highest. He writes, the removal of all the causes of pain marks the boundary of pleasure. Whenever pleasure is present, and as long as it continues, there's neither suffering nor grieving, nor both together. Or again, there is Principle Doctrine 10, that the desolate, this is another idea, but it's similar. Usually when we think about morality, we think that what is right and what is wrong, right? And we think about what is either virtuous or not virtuous. Morality has to do with values and acting rightly or not acting rightly. Now, Epicurus is a hedonist. So whatever brings pleasure is right. Pleasure is good. Pain is bad. So now, why not just do whatever you could get away with? He has no moral qualms about not acting rightly. But he does. It's not a moral qualm. He has no morality against not acting rightly. Like he mentions the desolate. Why not just become desolate and just do whatever brings pleasure to you? Why not be that kind of person if you're going to be an Epicurean? Well, here's his reasons why not. So he's against being desolate. He's not in favor of the desolate. It's because the wrongdoer, here's a good quote, Principle Doctrine 10. If the things that produce the pleasures of the desolate were able to drive away from their minds the fears about what is above them and about death and pain, and to teach them the limits of desires, we would have no scorn to find fault with the desolate, for they would fill themselves with pleasures from every source and would be free from pain and sorrow, which are evil. But The point is that being desolate doesn't put an end to that. What puts an end to that is a proper understanding of death and of divinity. But then he goes on in his critique of the desolate. Who are the desolate? The ones that don't care about acting rightly or wrongly, that they're just concerned about their own praise or blame, praise. We see people like that in politics sometimes. It's because the wrongdoer cannot put an end to the fear that he is at fault, not because of any vice in his character. See, this is where he parts company with Aristotle, right? We should act rightly because right action is the mean between two extremes. And so that will bring virtue, and virtue will bring happiness. For Epicurus, the reason we should act rightly is because if we don't, if we deliberately act in a vicious way, we could never put an end to the possibility of our fault being unmasked. Listen to Epicurus, Vatican saying 7. For a wrongdoer to be undetected is difficult, and for him to have confidence that his concealment will continue is impossible. So if you do something in private that you can't do in public, then you can never put an end to the possibility of getting caught or getting found out. That produces agitations in the mind. Some people say, how can you sleep at night? I think underneath that is this idea that when you do these wrongdoings and you think you've gotten away with it, how could you ever put an end? No, I think what they mean when they say that is, don't you have a conscience? That's probably not a good example. The point Epicurus is making here is that you can never put an end to being caught. You can't ever conceal yourself. So if you look at Principal Doctrines 34, the same idea, 35, same idea, 17, Principal Doctrine 17 and 53, all this is the same. It's consistent with Epicurus' view that the natural good is pleasure, freedom from bodily pain and mental agitations. So the unjust person, therefore, is unjust because he transgresses this hedonistic ethics, not because he's morally wrong in any other way, not because he's going to be punished in this life or the next, but only because he can't put an end to the agitations in his mind. And that's why we should act rightly. So that it's consistent with this hedonism. We talked about how I have there are extended discussions in the fragments or the Principal Doctrines about choice and rejection. Okay, so usually ethics has to do with what to choose and what to reject. And that's going to, at the end of this letter, he's going to praise phronesis. Now, the idea of phronesis in Epicurus is very different than phronesis in Aristotle and in Plato too. Remember I told you all these key words like phronesis, which means practical wisdom, is going to mean something different to these different philosophers. Knowing that helped me a lot in philosophy, because otherwise you just hear the word and you start thinking it all means the same thing, but it doesn't. It only means what this author says it means. Then what you try to do is try to find out what it means to you. But after listening to what these great thinkers have said, that's the mature way of going about it. But if you start thinking that these words mean the same thing for everybody, it all gets all mixed up and it just turns into one big muddy mess. Okay, so now we're talking about choice and rejection. The natural result of choosing and rejecting on the basis of Epicurean notion of pleasure results to a state of self-sufficiency. Epicurus praises self-sufficiency, the self-sufficient person. So what does he mean by that? Well, the Epicurean sage, or the person who follows the Epicurean way of life, becomes free from all unnatural and unnecessary desires, as we were talking about. He desires only those things that are necessary for life, for the removal of pain from the body, and for happiness. So these natural desires are easily procured. You don't have to struggle to get these things. But all vain and unnatural desires are hard to obtain. And to the one who can't obtain them, this person becomes miserable. So what Epicurus wants us to do is think about our desires, think about what counts, and put our efforts there. And that's going to be very easy to obtain. It's all in your state of mind. This is what he's trying to cultivate, a particular gratuitous state of mind, a state of mind that's thankful for life. This is, I think, what's at the heart of Epicurus and why I return to him again and again. I became an Epicurean, and to a certain extent, because I value this idea that it's little that brings the best happiness. It's a state of mind. It's all in our state of our way of being in the world, our attitude toward being. And what I find in Epicurus is this gratitude that here, my body's healthy. Like right now, I'm 69 years old. I'm not in excruciating pain right now. My mind feels I'm doing what I was born to do. I feel so lucky. This is it for Epicurus. I'm equal to Zeus. My happiness is equal to Zeus because I have no pains in my body and my mind is tranquil. I mean, it's not in this deep state of samadhi like in Hindu philosophy or Buddhism, but there's no agitations there. So in other words, this way of life leads to self-sufficiency or independence from all unnatural, unnecessary desires. So the simple pleasures then become equal to the most complex pleasures. For pleasure at its highest is simply the removal of pain from the body and the soul. Anything beyond this doesn't increase our pleasure, but just varies its quality. So the quantity is the same. The highest quantity of pleasure is a body without pain and a mind without agitations. And from that point, there's only qualitative differences. Finally, if we accustom ourselves to a simple and good life, then we're put into a better frame of mind to enjoy luxury when and if it comes. And if it does not come, since we're not dependent upon the unnatural desires, we're rendered fearless against fortune. And when one becomes fearless against whatever fortune throws his or her way, she becomes utterly free. The happy and blessed life of the Epicurean sage is happy and blessed because it's free. And then there's this one golden epigram that I had remembered, that freedom is the greatest fruit of self-sufficiency. So if you can become self-sufficient, by that he doesn't mean you don't need people, you think you can live without people, without anything. What he means is eliminating all unnatural, unnecessary desires. You don't need much to be happy. Freedom is the greatest fruit of self-sufficiency. If we don't become independent of all vain desires and learn to desire only what is natural and necessary, then we're filled with mental disturbances because our desires are unfulfilled. Our feelings of being unsatisfied stretch on, and so we become one who's never satisfied. Oh, there's another golden epigram that I love. Nothing satisfies he who is not satisfied by little. That's a good one by Epicurus. Nothing satisfies he who's not satisfied by a little. So you see, the Epicurean philosophy is very different from what normal people think is associated with Epicurus. I mean, restaurants call their place, their dishes an Epicurean delight, and we always associate Epicurus with pleasure, which is true. He was a hedonist, but it's not about these sumptuous banquets and what the way the Romans interpreted it. Not Lucretius, not the great Romans, but the Roman people. They turned it into eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. They got part of it right. Tomorrow you will die. And the eat, drink, and be merry, it's just another sentiment, but it's a Roman interpretation of Epicurus. So our natural desires are easily obtained, while our vain desires are hard to fulfill. So this is where the struggle comes in. The latter leads to a life of unending struggle, and the former a life without struggle. He writes in Principal Doctrines 15, natural wealth is limited and easily obtained. The wealth defined by vain fancies is always beyond reach. Or another, Principal Doctrine 21. The man who understands the limits of living knows that it's easy to obtain that which removes the pain caused by want, and that which perfects the whole life. Therefore, he has no need of things that involve struggle. I always think of the psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But we pass by that. Of course, that comes later, and I'm sure it doesn't come out of Epicurus, but it's consistent with the Epicurean philosophy. And again, what seems to be a life of poverty to the common man is a life of wealth to the Epicurean. And conversely, what appears to be a life of wealth to the common man is a life of poverty to the Epicurean. For he cannot possess great material wealth without servitude to others. And so Epicurus writes in the Vatican Sayings 25, poverty, if in proper proportion to the natural purposes of life, is great wealth, but the wealth that is unlimited is great poverty. You can see how this goes against the natural grain of Western civilization in the 21st century, not just here in the United States. It's extreme here in the United States, but throughout the world, under a capitalist world, where every commercial is trying to generate a new desire, right? And the whole notion of happiness is, the whole idea of the American dream is to get things and pile them up and try to keep them and become wealthy. The middle class want to become wealthy. Poor people want to become wealthy. Middle class want to become wealthy. The wealthy want to keep their wealth, and they don't really, some of them don't really care, if they don't circulate their wealth and if they hoard it and create more poverty. So the whole world is moving in an opposite direction. But there's no reason why one can't walk another path and still live in this world. You can be in the world. You have to be in the world. You can't get out of this world. But you don't have to be of the world. And of course, that means something else in Christianity. But there are elements in Christian mysticism that are consistent with Epicurean philosophy. This idea of being in the world and not of the world. But Epicurus would interpret it his own way. To be in the world would mean to live in this world where happiness means acquiring things. To be of the world would mean that. But not being of the world would mean eliminate all unnecessary and unnatural desires and cultivate this gratitude towards life. Just try to eliminate the pains from your body. Have you ever thought about that? I was thinking once, probably the most important thing to an individual is the health of their body. I mean, that's, if not the most important thing, because everything is based on that. If you don't have health in your body, then everything else goes down the drain. And then in high school, I remember health classes were like the least important things. If you couldn't do anything else, you couldn't get into college prep courses and things like that. If you're just going to, then you just take health, and then it became some class for losers. Meanwhile, it's like the most important thing in the world. So we have to rethink our values and put what's important at the center. And so Epicurus is putting health of the body there at the center, and health of the mind. Do not spoil what you have by desiring what you don't have. But remember that what you now have was once among the things that you only hoped for. One time I met some guy, he was whistling, and I was at the gym in the locker room. He was happy as can be. He had a really good voice too. He sang in the choir and he had this wonderful voice. I said, "You seem happy, Jim." He said, "Yeah, I learned a long time ago, Joe. If you count the things you do have, it makes you happy. If you think about the things you don't have, then you get sad." I thought, oh my God, that's as simple as it gets. And here I have this PhD in philosophy, and he just said it all in one simple sentence. This is what Epicurus is teaching. Count your blessings. These have become cliches, but sometimes cliches contain, even though they are cliches, and it's good to stay away from cliches because they're worn out metaphors and you use them and people just think the same thing over and over again. It's like, but sometimes at the heart of a cliche is some deep wisdom. Maybe that's one of the reasons they hang around for some time, like count your blessings. Oh, one more. There is also a limit, he writes, in simple living. He who fails to heed this falls into an error as great as that of the man who gives way to extravagance. The letter ends with a panegyric in praise of prudence. Prudence is sometimes a translation of phronesis. So when I see the word phronesis, I just leave it. I told you that. When I come to keywords in philosophy that are in another language, I just leave them in that language. And then that way, I told you, you can sidestep a lot of, you don't have to fight against connotations that cling to the word because of certain things. So I just leave it and I'll use the transliteration for people who haven't studied like Greek or Chinese or whatever, or Sanskrit or something. But these words mean something different to different people. So usually when you see the word prudence, see, I don't use the word prudence to translate phronesis because usually prudence is used with money matters. Like somebody is prudent because they don't overspend and they know how to spend their money, which is one form of prudence. But so I just leave phronesis, leave it as phronesis. But your book translates it as prudence, which is fine. Just know that the word is phronesis. And it's going to mean something different from Epicurus than it does for Aristotle and for Plato. So after establishing the general character of his ideal, Epicurus proceeds to consider further his method of attaining it. It's clear that the right course of action will not be discovered by instinct. It's necessary in order to live the true it is necessary in order to live the truly pleasant life to have a right judgment in all things. So this is what he means by prudence, acting rightly, to have a right judgment in all things, based upon a calculation of the less and more of pleasure and pain. So right judgment, Epicurus says, is phronesis, or practical wisdom. And it's not the same as speculative wisdom, or Sophia. Prudence or practical wisdom, he says, is at once the beginning of any step in the right direction and the best thing that a human being can attain. And it's more valuable than speculative wisdom. So by speculative wisdom, he means understanding the universe, like all those books he wrote on astronomy and on physics and things like that, and seeing how all that combines together. Speculative wisdom is knowing the whole story of existence, divine and human. And that's, for Aristotle, by the way, that's the highest. This is a big difference. But for Epicurus, the accent is on action, on morality. And the greatest happiness comes in knowing that you've achieved practical wisdom. So he puts practical wisdom above speculative wisdom. I think if you study Aristotle, in fact, book 10 of the Ethics, which we didn't go over, he gives arguments why Aristotle gives why speculative wisdom, the happiness that accompanies contemplation of the first principles of being, is the greatest happiness. Later on, St. Thomas Aquinas will use that to talk about contemplating God becoming the greatest joy. But for Epicurus, higher than speculative wisdom is practical wisdom, because it pertains to our choices in life. And without practical wisdom, one can't live a blessed life. So this is the big difference between Plato, between Aristotle and Epicurus. What will be the instruction given by phronesis or prudence? It will be the recommendation of the accepted virtues. So Epicurus is going to recommend becoming virtuous, like Aristotle taught, but not because virtue is good and vice is bad, but because vice leads to agitations of the mind, and for that reason, vice is bad. So it's different reasons why, but he recommends virtue over vice, but not for any moral reasons, or not for any reasons of being judged right or wrong, but because of the agitations of the mind. What will be the recommendation of the accepted virtues, he says? It will be shown that the pleasant life is really that in which honor and justice are practiced. Thus, by a strict line of reasoning, Epicurus, starting from his first principle of the pursuit of pleasure as the ideal, he reaches the acceptance on his own grounds, though, on hedonistic grounds, of the recognized standards of morality. And so he's countering the criticisms of his detractors. You see, by the time Epicurus started his garden, the Platonic Academy, well, Plato had been deceased a long time ago, but the Academy just was the strongest philosophical school in the Greek world. And then Epicurus starts his garden, and he's got women there as students. He's got slaves, which he freed at his death, in his will, and he's teaching hedonistic principles when Plato and Aristotle were gone out of their way to show that pleasure is not the highest good. Remember, for Aristotle, this is an important point. For Aristotle, pleasure is not the highest good because it's something that we share in common with animals. It's part of our animal nature. So he wants to look for something that's unique to humans. And he finds that in eudaimonia, acting in conformity with virtue. But Aristotle's thinking about pleasure in the physical sense, anaplerosis, the dynamic pleasures, kinetic pleasures. But Epicurus is talking about pleasure in a wider sense, the kinetic, the static pleasures of no pains in the body. So they're coming at it from two different directions. And so that's a big difference. But I was starting to tell you that the school was under attack by a lot of Platonists and other intellectuals. And so he had to defend this hedonistic way of life. And on his own principles, then, he advances the standards of recognized morality, but for different reasons, all on hedonistic principles. Because by not being virtuous, you create agitations in your mind, and you can't live the blessed life. He says it's impossible to live pleasantly without living prudently and honorably and justly, and to live prudently, honorably, and justly without living pleasantly. Even though a man live honorably and justly, it is not possible for him to live pleasantly if he lacks that from which stems the prudent life. In other words, the pleasant life is impossible without practical wisdom, without honor, and without justice. And even though a man may live honorably and justly, a pleasant life is impossible if he lacks practical wisdom. And so the pleasant life, the prudent life, the honorable life, and the just life are all connected. Okay? It's also clear why, for Epicurus, it's impossible to live a pleasant life without living justly. We can see that for him, justice is a compact made by man which they make to protect themselves. When I was rereading Epicurus to prepare for these lectures, I came across a very early notion of the social contract, which came much later in philosophy by Rousseau and John Locke and others, that we create this just society and we make laws for our own protection, that we don't infringe on other people's rights, and we make a compact, and we create laws. This is all connected. Natural justice is a compact, he writes, resulting from expedients by which men seek to prevent one man from injuring others and to protect him from being injured by them. Maybe you could relate that to either wearing a mask or not wearing a mask today. So, in order not to be injured by others, we need the compact of natural justice. This is why it's impossible to live the pleasant life without living the just life. We need justice to protect ourselves from others. And there's a whole bunch of principal doctrines. So he ends with a panegyric to the prudent man. He ends his philosophical letter to his disciple Menoetius with a panegyric. A panegyric is a song in praise of something. It's a poetic form where you're praising something. And he's praising the prudent man. He sings the praise of the man who possesses practical wisdom, and he places this as the highest. For Aristotle, speculative wisdom is the highest. Those three intellectual virtues, episteme, noesis, and then sophia, which is the highest. For Aristotle, I didn't mention this when I talked about Aristotle, but the reason the contemplative life is the best kind of life is that the objects of contemplation are the greatest objects. So the revelation of those objects will bring the greatest pleasure. And then the intellect is the greatest part of a human being. So the activity of the intellect will bring about the greatest joy or happiness for Aristotle. And also it's most akin to the activities of divinity, which is contemplation. Today we talk about God being omniscient. So when we engage in knowledge activities, we're acting in the image of God. But for Epicurus, higher than this speculative wisdom is practical wisdom. He's got his feet more down to earth. In fact, I would say that this is true of later Greek philosophy. The emphasis is mostly on morality and on living. And that's why the Romans gravitated toward, well, it was closer to them in time too. The late Greek philosophy was closer to the Roman conquering of Greece, and then Greece became a province of Rome. And when the Romans appropriated Greek philosophy, they took the later Greek philosophy, namely Epicureanism, Stoicism, the Cynics, and the Skeptics, but mostly the Epicureans and the Stoics. I remember Nietzsche said every good citizen of Rome was an Epicurean. But that may not be true completely because some were Stoics too. In fact, there was a great Stoic author and king, and it reminds me of Plato's philosopher king. He was a great philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, there's a big statue of him in Rome. We saw a bronze. It's famous, actually. It's in all the art history books. And he was a Stoic. He followed Epictetus, and he became himself great Stoic. And he wrote books that are part of the canon Western civilization and philosophy. And he was a king. He was an emperor, Marcus Aurelius. So he ends with this panegyric to the prudent man. He says, he returned in this panegyric, he returns to many of the themes that he presented before. It's the prudent one who knows the conditions of life, namely a true understanding of the nature of the gods and of death, who realizes the government of the world and the responsibility of the free-willed human being. He sees in chance, this is an interesting point, not a determinant. Epicurus believed in chance, remember the swerve of the atoms? So chance is not a deterrent of action, but an opportunity, and prefers to suffer with wisdom rather than to prosper through folly. He taught how to transform whatever happens into something that would further your pleasure. This is a great art, actually. It takes time. I've tried to work at it in my own way. Like during this pandemic, I've learned to become a better musician, and I'm training my dogs. He's better than he ever was before. And without the pandemic, I don't think I would have learned to play music the way I can play now. And my dog would never be as well trained. So I'm not saying the pandemic was a good thing, but what you want to do is just take whatever happens and learn how to transform it into something that when it's finished, or even if it doesn't finish, it will bring about some enhancement in some way. This is an art that can be cultivated, but you have to sign up for it and you have to work at it. And it's like any art, you get better at it. And some things are just devastating when they happen. So there's no way of transforming it. The only thing you can do is try to process your trauma. But if resistance can just bend you and not break you, then it's something good. So we should notice the following points with regard to the panegyric. Let me just list these points and then I'll try to bring this talk to an end. I have too many. I have notes enough here for a course on Epicurus, but I'll just mention these points here that I find important at the end of this letter to Menoesis, the panegyric in praise of the prudent man. The prudent man holds holy or reverent opinions concerning the gods. He's using that word very carefully. He's saying, if you project all too human projections into God. I had an interesting talk with my mother. She goes, God is trying so hard. She goes, things are really bad. It sounds like a comedy skit. And I said, well, I don't know, Mom. Does he need to try? She says, yeah, he's carrying the whole world. I said, but Mom, to him, it must be light because he's all powerful. That's his definition. It was a last night, in fact, comical discussion with my mother. She goes, I know, but it's a big weight to carry the whole world. I said, but if you're all powerful, it's just like she goes, he tries as hard as he can. I said, but Mom, he doesn't have to try anything because he's all powerful. So we got into this comical discussion about God. She goes, well, people just need to have faith. That's all. But Epicurus is teaching we need to hold. The reason I'm focusing on this because this becomes an issue in Christian mysticism later on about prayer and about our proper attitude towards divinity. It has to do with our understanding of what it. I mean, if you say, "Do you believe in God?" and somebody says, "Yes, I believe in," the other says, "No," that doesn't tell you much. I mean, one's an atheist, one's a deist. Okay, you know that. But then, if you ask the deist, who is God? What is God? And they start saying some really simple-minded things that are just metaphysically, just bad metaphysics, then it's not as good as somebody who can think more deeply about God, right? So it's not a matter of whether you believe in God or not. It's a matter of what do you think God is? And, we try to deepen our understanding of God. So what Epicurus is doing is the prudent person holds reverent or blessed, reverent opinions about the gods or about divinity. And for him, what that means is restrained from projecting all too human qualities onto divinity, like my mother was doing. But it was, in her case, it was endearing because she says God is trying so hard, he's carrying the world. And I'm thinking, so I just played a kind of comical role, knowing that if God is all powerful, then carrying the world must be light, like a feather, right? So or that God is trying, how can God try anything? When you try something, you run the risk of failing, right? So if God is perfect and all powerful and all knowing and eternal, then he wouldn't try anything. He just does it. He thinks it and it happens, or he says it and it happens. So it just comes from my years of studying metaphysics and philosophy of religion and a different view of faith. So the prudent man, Epicurus teaches, holds holy or reverent opinions about the gods. For to know that their true nature as immortal and tranquil divine beings who do not concern themselves with the affairs of this world is wholly true. Holy opinions, unlike the unholy opinions and suppositions of the many. So, he takes it even further, that divinity has no concern for humans at all. See, you have to put yourself back in ancient Greece at the time. The Greek people thought that the gods intervened in human activities, and they're sort of enjoying watching these humans going through this tragedy and suffering. It's like they're watching some tragedy, on the stage, and they intervene with humans. And so Epicurus is fighting against that literal notion of the gods in ancient times, and he's trying to say, think a little bit more deeply about divinity. And it's getting closer to the monotheistic notion that we find in the Christian mystics. The prudent man is free from fear of death. That's the other thing that's important. The prudent man has reasoned out the final end of the blessed life as the natural end ordained by nature. We don't want to bypass that either. It's pretty obvious that in nature, whatever is pleasant attracts, and whatever is unpleasant detours. People avoid. Not just people, animals too. That's what all behaviors, reward and punishment and is based on in training, in behaviorist training of animals and things like that. Whatever's pleasant is appealing. And then whatever's unpleasant. And so operant conditioning is all based on that. Animals operate on their environment. Whatever is giving them what they need, they go there. And whatever is against them, they avoid that. It's just deep in the natural world. It reaches all the way into the plant kingdom. The plants will turn toward the light. So there's this naturalism in Epicurus. So the prudent man has reasoned out the final end of the blessed life as the natural end ordained by nature. He has found pleasure to be the beginning and end of the blessed life. The prudent man understands that the maxim of pleasure, a life without pain in the body or mind, is easy to fulfill and easy to obtain. He knows that the cause of ill is either short in time or slight in pain. He's talking about bodily pain. If it's intense, it will be short. If it's long, in between, there'll be more pleasure than pain. He laughs and hence rises above destiny, whom some have introduced as the mistress of all things. In other words, the prudent man thinks that within us lies the chief power in determining events, some of which happen by necessity and some which occur by chance. The Epicurean sage is free from necessity and chance in the sense that he can accept what has been given to him by necessity and chance, and to freely choose how to respond to what has been given. In other words, we find ourselves in a world not of our own making. Some things come by chance, Some things come by necessity. And so we know that. And so now, how to respond to that? Well, he gives us principles of choice and rejection. He can choose to pursue or avoid, or on the basis of pleasure, as the motive and end of all of his or her responses to what necessity and chance throw his way. What necessity offers us is out of our control and is therefore irresponsible. What chance offers us is inconsistent and out of our control. Necessity and chance, therefore, are out of our control and hence cannot account for our happiness or unhappiness. In other words, we're morally our own masters. But to repeat, how we respond to these is subject to no power outside of our own freedom of choice. And this is why only our actions merit praise or blame, because only they are in our freedom. He's in possession of this idea that the world can't be completely determined. If it were, then there's no such thing as praise or blame. There would be no morality because everything is just given. So there has to be free choice. And this freedom then comes in how do we respond to chance and necessity. Finally, the prudent man believes that it's better to be a prudent person who meets misfortune than to be an imprudent person who happens upon good fortune. In other words, it's better to meet misfortune while acting with reason than to happen upon good fortune while acting senselessly. Why? Because in the long run, being a prudent man ensures a pleasant life, whereas in the long run, being a senseless person only enslaves one to the natural dictates of necessity and chance. And he gives some final words to Menoesis. In these final words of the letter, Epicurus tells Menoesis that the constant meditation on these and similar percepts, alone or with a like-minded friend, will result in a realization of the highest state attainable by mortals, a state we know of as ataraxia. And then he writes, then never, either awake or asleep, will you be dismayed, but you will be like a god among men, for life amid immortal blessings is in no way life like the life of a mere mortal. In other words, the mortal life is one that sometimes is upset by what chance and necessity throws its way. But the Epicurean sage has attained the state of sustained ataraxia. He says, then never, either awake or asleep, will you be in a troubled or agitated state. But only the gods live in such a state. So he concludes, but you will live like a god among men, for life amid immortal blessings is in no way like the life of a mere mortal. Epicurus has this idea of the gods being in this detached state of tranquility, and he wants humans to live in that same state. So there's so much more to Epicurus, even in this letter. And if you connect the key ideas in the letter to the principal doctrines and to the Vatican sayings, then you have a pretty full view of Epicurus. But it's such a loss that a man who was so prolific, 347 books, we only have these 3 letters and these charred remains. But again, we have Lucretius, and it's a beautiful book. It's a big, long poem, and it lays out the whole of Epicurean philosophy. Okay, so that's my 2 abbreviated accounts of the teaching of this great master of Samos, Epicurus. Thanks.